Let's talk now to Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist, and have another fascinating hour. Peter, a very good morning to you.
Morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, I know that you probably won't particularly want to dwell upon the ghastly nature of this interview over in California, but I know that you will have been a keen observer of the kind of Republican side of the Blair government when I was at the Express. I think you still were as well during the time when Princess Diana died, and there was an awful lot of game playing going on between Campbell, Blair, and others who thought they saw an opportunity to turn that into a sort of movement to get rid of the royal family. I don't see that happening here, do you?
No, but of course we're many, many steps further down the long staircase to abolishing the monarchy, which I think is now something much, much closer than most people would have thought 20 years ago. And this kind of thing, whatever you think about it, is bound to do damage. And one of the ways in which it will do damage, I think, is that the current reign inevitably has to end. Let us hope not for a long time. But when it does, the huge personal popularity of the Queen will no longer stand between the monarchy and its enemies. And there are many of those enemies, and a lot of them are not open about their enmity. Certainly the upper echelons of the Labour Party under Blair, I would very much doubt whether there's a single convinced monarchist anywhere to be found there. They'll mouth support for the monarchy, but I don't think they really believe in it. Right. And of course, there is the other great danger coming from the Commonwealth countries such as Australia, where, again, I think that a movement for a republic will emerge soon after the next reign begins, and that could well find ways of coming back to the home country. So I think the monarchy does face a huge crisis, and one of its problems is that it is very, very hard to reconcile a monarchy to the modern world, as I think we saw last night.
Yes, I think that's right. And as you say, the enemies of monarchy in general will feast on this and will pick away at it for weeks and weeks and months and all of that that will go on. And certainly when the question comes, should Prince Charles be the next king, there will be a lot of argument about why he shouldn't be and why it should go straight to William, presumably.
Well, this has been said a lot by people who I think are fundamentally opposed to the monarchy as such. It's the law that makes the monarchy, and the law of succession is quite clear. If you skip a generation, then you're defying that law. You're basically undermining the principle of the thing itself. And once you start doing that, then the rest can go pretty quickly. I just don't think there's any particular understanding of monarchy. There's some sort of sentimental liking to the royal family sometimes when they behave themselves according to certain rules and when people feel like liking them. But that's not enough. You have to understand the point of monarchy, which, in my view, is fundamentally to keep certain things out of the hands of politicians. You don't want politicians standing before great parades of the armed forces. You don't want politicians taking the salute or riding in fancy carriages before the crowds. You don't want them, in general, becoming the sort of autocratic figures which monarchs used to be and are no longer. The monarch, as I've said many times, is like the king on a chessboard. Very little power in its own right, but it keeps other pieces off those important squares. Once it's gone, the chances of politicians muscling in on those ceremonial and self-glorificatory areas of life, of starting to preen themselves and become more autocratic, are very great. And I think that it's quite interesting to note that most of the longest surviving law-governed free countries in the world are constitutional monarchies, and it's quite hard to find torture chambers in countries which are constitutional monarchies, and quite easy to find them in republics.
Yes, I think that's very true. Not in this particular republic, of course. But what about the press and the way...
Well, we don't know, Mike. That's all I know.
I can assure you, I'll be happy to allow anyone in to have a look around. As far as the press is concerned, I was listening to a debate the other night about this and the sort of the effective weakening of the media in this country. And I know people don't agree with me when I say this, but I think in terms of the royal family, you know, when you and I were both working in the press together, there was a much more strong sense that the press kind of controlled the royal family rather than the other way around. But now, with Harry and Meghan, the press is much less important, isn't it? And I mean, incredibly, this judge who keeps giving awards to her, including making the Mail on Sunday put a front page apology up, which seems extraordinary to me, is the fact that the press is no longer an influence, perhaps, on them important?
Well, the press is less powerful anyway, and a lot of people don't like the press, and they have, in some cases, good reason not to like it, because it's a hard to control and hard to like beast. But the point is that in any society where you have a strong independent press, you have a power which actually helps to create and sustain freedom. And as the press has grown weaker commercially and in terms of circulation, visibly in our lifetimes, it seems to me we've become less of a free country, and an awful lot more opinion is now controlled by the to me rather creepy algorithms of the big tech giants, who decide more and more what we can hear and what we can see and what we can think, and direct people in certain ways. And there was something, it's to me very valuable in a strong, independent, diverse press, some of it on the left, some of it on the right, which has been lost. I think the monarchy also has got very tired of the way in which it was treated, and has abandoned what at the time was a sensible policy of never getting involved in these brawls and spats. But I think the Diana event was a revolution in our country, and it changed relations between the monarchy and the public, the monarchy and the press, the monarchy and parliament and politicians, totally and irreversibly. Yeah. We keep going through these revolutions, and people don't actually realize how much has been changed by them, because no one announces we've had a revolution. Lenin doesn't move into Buckingham Palace, but there has been a big change, and part of it has been achieved by very, very dedicated radicals who took over the Labour Party and came to power in 1997 and continue in many ways to be in power, because they then took over the Conservative Party.
Well, yes, and they also took over, as I think you've pointed out before, many of the great sort of institutions of this country, whether they be academic institutions, the civil service. You know, these are all sort of, they used to talk about Thatcher's children. These are all Blair's children, aren't they?
Well, yes, but in some ways both, because Thatcher was very interested in economics and money. And personally, I've no doubt she was a patriot and a Christian and all kinds of things, but her government was not in any way socially or politically or morally conservative about education or the family or any of those things. And so she prepared the way for Blairism. And so, as Harold Wilson did as well with his great cultural revolution under Roy Jenkins in the 60s. It's been a long, long process, but the really radical bit of it, particularly the beginnings of huge constitutional change, were undertaken by the Blair government. People don't understand. I still remember colleagues of mine on the Daily Express, very conservative-minded people, saying to me in the late 1990s, "Oh, Tony Blair, he's the best Conservative Prime Minister we ever had." And I looked at these people in despair. I said, "How can you not see what they're really up to?" Because the reason why they couldn't see is unlike me, they had no experience of revolutionary politics. They couldn't recognize the codes or the language. But Blair, this is a fascinating thing. Blair was himself a Trotskyist at Oxford, a fact which he concealed successfully throughout his period as leader of the opposition and prime minister for long years after. If people had known that in 1997, what would they have thought?
Yeah.
But when it actually came out in a BBC Radio 4 interview, quite prominently with Peter Hitchens, it didn't appear in any newspaper at all. It was as if people had decided it didn't compute with the idea that they had a Blair, therefore they were not going to accept it. A huge number of, and this is public knowledge, I've written about it in a lengthy article for the Mail on Sunday, a huge number of Blair's cabinet were themselves supposedly ex-Marxist members of or associates of Trotskyist or communist organizations. And those are the ones we know about. And the more you look at it, the more you think how peculiar it is. And the radicalism of Blair was not about nationalizing the winkle industry. It was about education and about the family, about abolishing the status of fatherhood and the word husband, about making sure the schools continued to be egalitarian, about the Equality Act, which basically turned this country into a politically correct country by law. All these things were done, and because they came individually and people didn't see any sense of them, the recognition, once again, that we underwent and are still undergoing a revolution is still hardly to be found at all. People don't realize what's been going on.
And there were plenty of clues, weren't there? There were loads of clues. I mean, they had this sort of evergreen relationship with the word people, which at the time I never really thought about, and as you say, not very many people did. But they had famously their party on election night when they won in 1997 was at the People's Palace. You know, they talked about Princess Diana being the people's princess. You know, they tried to get the word people into as many things as possible. They talked about the project as if it was some kind of, you know, communist manifesto. And when, as you've pointed out before, the streets were lined in Downing Street with people who we thought were genuinely actually fans of Tony Blair getting elected, when it turned out they were all actually employed by the Labour Party, we all fell for it.
It was completely stationary. That clip of those people standing in Downing Street waving Union Jacks is still shown as if it were a genuine event. It keeps cropping up in archive. Hardly anybody ever says, I did once in a programme I managed to get it in. Hardly anybody says this is a staged event, because the people there couldn't have got into Downing Street without permission. It's closed.
Yeah, but at the time, we all kind of went, isn't this great? Isn't it great to be born into...
I didn't, but I mean, a lot of people did do.
Well, most people did.
Yeah, they did, and people still fall for it. But I remember I think it was in the Labour manifesto in '97. The New Labour said they were the political arm of the British people as a whole.
Yeah,
amazing claim, completely untrue. But that's what they said. I just think that the radicalism of New Labour, which then turned into a huge assault on the Conservative Party in the late '90s and the early parts of this century, bludgeoning and clubbing the Conservative Party until it accepted Blairism. After which, when David Cameron became the leader of the Conservative Party as a Blairite and as an open admirer of Blair, the Conservative Party was allowed by the BBC to back into the company of civilised life, and was treated once again as if it was a proper party, having been exiled and treated with contempt for all the intervening years. And after that, the Conservative Party came back into politics. But the Conservative Party, yes, as Blairite, this IRA business, which sparked my latest article about Roy Greenslade. Remember, Claire Fox, whose support for the so-called armed struggle in Ireland is pretty much as strong as that of Mr. Greenslade, former editor of the Daily Mirror. Well, Claire Fox is now in the House of Lords, put there by one Alexander Boris Pleffel Johnson. So that it's not confined to the Labour Party, this extraordinary attitude towards the IRA, which Greenslade has now openly avowed. A lot of people suspected it for a long time. Anyway, he's openly avowed it. I remember, as a revolutionary student in the 1970s, a particular organisation, the International Marxist Group, would go around shouting victory to the IRA on demonstrations. Even then, I was a Bolshevik, but even then I found that disgusting. But they did, and quite a large number of the people who found their way into Blair's cabinet are former associates of that International Marxist Group.
And do you suspect that may have had some kind of bearing on how the Good Friday Agreement was drawn up then?
Well, it's certainly the case that it looked very much to me as if back in 1997, 98, that Sinn Féin were dragging their feet with John Major, who would probably have given them pretty much the same deal, because they thought they would get more out of a Blair government than they would out of the Tories. I think that may have been the opportunity. But the truth is that the British government's surrender to the IRA is one thing, but the characterisation of it as a great and glorious peace process is another. And the loss of will in the British establishment to fight what, in my view, was always, not just in the case of the IRA, but also in the case of the so-called loyalist organisations, to fight these criminal terrorist gangs, faded very much away. And really in the 80s and 90s, it's a long and complicated thing. But what is definitely the case is that sympathy for the IRA at fairly high levels of British left-wing politics is not confined to Mr. Roy Greenslade.
No.
He has at least been open about it.
Well, true. But we also have the rather unedifying spectacle now of all of these IRA terrorists having been freed from prison and not prosecuted further, and some of them not prosecuted at all, whereas you've got soldiers, former soldiers from Belfast, from British Army regiments, who are still being pursued for claims against them.
Well, that's in the nature of it. The so-called peace process, or the Belfast Agreement, or the instrument of surrender, as I call it, is that people often say, oh, it was a victory for Britain. Well, if it was a victory for Britain, why is it that known former killers from the IRA are effectively amnestied, whereas British soldiers and members of the security forces in general are still being pursued? It's an obvious sign of how that agreement was, in fact, a surrender. Because the weaker party is the one which gets the worst terms, isn't it? In a surrender, it's the beaten person who has to accept humiliations. We have to accept the humiliation of our own soldiers being pursued in the courts. If any IRA person is pursued in the courts, then very rapidly that pursuit comes to an end because we've agreed to stop doing it. And there's no clearer sign of the balance of that agreement being on the side of the IRA and against Britain.
Absolutely right. Now, last time you and I spoke, Peter, last week, you told us about how you had kind of basically given in to the government's oppression and you'd got the vaccination, and even though you didn't think it was worth having. A couple of people over the weekend asked me about whether you were okay because you weren't on Twitter for 2 days. I mean, this is the nature of the beast, unfortunately, that if you take a break from something that you're normally doing, people then become worried. I mean, have you decided to stay off it for a while?
No, I'm glad they're worried. I mean, I have felt several times, actually, over the past several months, I've had to fling myself into Twitter because of it was an incredibly useful weapon in the fight against the stupidity of the government's action. A fight which I should point out here, I pretty much began alone, and which I have not ceased to undertake. I haven't given in. I slightly resent the use of that phrase.
Okay. I stand corrected in that case.
Well, no, I never said anything about the vaccination in terms of saying I was against it or urging other people to have it or not have it. And that's still my position. What I revealed was a private decision. And in the past few days, I just felt I've been on this thing. If you aren't careful, you dive into the screen and it takes over your life. And
it is all-consuming.
I've had particular reasons, good ones, I might say, particular reasons to concentrate more upon my private life. You might say, as Arnold Schwarzenegger might say, I'll be back. Don't you worry. I have some very interesting
stuff. In that case,
I have very interesting stuff to reveal to the world towards the end of this week, which I promise you I'll be using Twitter for. But it actually, when I gave it a break, I began to enjoy giving it a break. Yeah. So I might extend it. It's
well, funnily enough, I mean, I always quote Giles Corran on this one because Giles Corran's had a rather interesting sort of engagement and relationship with Twitter on and off, and he sometimes gets himself into trouble. But he once was talking on the radio about how he gave it up for a while, and he realised how much time out of his day that it was taking. He suddenly had more time. He suddenly was able to talk to his children more. You know, he said, I was finding myself going for walks in the woods and hooking into Twitter while he's walking around. And it is incredibly addictive.
Well, as you possibly know, I don't believe there is any such thing as addiction. We've all got power over ourselves, and I think this is a demonstration of that. I decided it was taking up too much of my time. I was probably enjoying it too much. But there were other things. I mean, eventually, I suppose, if you talk to your children too much, they start saying, hey, would you mind going back on Twitter? We've had enough.
There is definitely that.
But even the people in the woods say that you've been wandering around these woods fighting. Could you mind going back on Twitter? But just for the moment, I agree that the children and the woods look more attractive, especially as spring begins to show. No, it was once I tried it, I thought, hey, this is nice.
Yes, absolutely. Some time to yourself. Okay, well, we'll look forward to that.
No hurry at the moment. I've got other things on my mind today.
Okay, good. Just one final question quickly, Peter. The school's going back today. I'm in the process of having to deal with school because my kids are still at school. And this whole mask wearing business, which is now being presented as though it's some kind of moral shall we say, imperative. They can't make you wear a mask, but they are going to shame you into it.
Well, I know there is this body called Us for Them. I've signed their declaration, which points out that the government has itself many times said that school children don't need to and shouldn't wear masks. And I've tried to have this argument about masks over and over and over again, but it has become a sort of shibboleth of the pro-lockdown movement, and it's very important to them. And I suspect that after all this is over, there will still be a lot of moral pressure on people to wear masks. I mean, I wish you luck in resisting it, but this moral pressure is hard because it puts children in the middle of it.
Yeah,
it does. Put a child in the middle of such a battle, and they know that parents are going to say, oh, for goodness sake, why should I expose my child to being the only person in the class not wearing the mask? And they force people to give in this way, and it's shocking. But again, like the other things, this is a revolution we're going through. a revolution in which we are becoming daily less free, less individual, more regimented, and more subject to, in my view, intolerable social pressures to behave in ways we don't want to. And this has happened to this country, and it's happened because I couldn't get many people to fight against it at the time before it had hardened into a fact. Back, a year ago, March, April, May, June. If more people had joined me in fighting against this, we wouldn't have this rubbish. But they didn't. So we do. So don't tell me I've given in. It was other people who gave in or didn't even fight. And those are the ones you need to blame if you start looking around for people to blame. Thanks.
Okay, Peter. Well said. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens, good luck with the staying off of Twitter for a while, but he will be back. He'll be back with us, of course, every Monday at 11 o'clock, because that's what we like to do.